Meh, 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 meh. Meow. We return to the crew following a night of somewhat disturbed sleep. With the addition of the fabrication bench, the poop processor, the new heater in the shared room, and soon to be the multi-analyzer, the crew's power supply was struggling to keep the lights on during the night. As the issue seemed to be keeping the batteries fully charged, as opposed to having enough batteries, they utilised some of the new components which Tercio had crafted to add an additional solar panel into the mix. With the ability to turn steel into components and, feeling as though they had plenty of steel, the crew were finally free to add additional tech to their setup. They started by finishing the multi-analyzer, and then they rebuilt the research bench, which Jay had destroyed in his anger. With these upgrades, their research speed would hit new highs, bringing them ever closer to understanding space travel. The crew were making good progress, however morale was still up and down. In an effort to improve this, Brom suggested that she spend some time furnishing the rooms of the residents with tiled floors. They'd not yet had time to beautify the rooms, so they still had floors of dirt and grass, and the tiling would be a significant improvement. Just as things seemed to be calming down for a little bit, the crew were treated to some good news. Kelsier was pregnant. With the addition of the new drill and the research bench, the power grid was becoming a little strained again, so a fifth solar panel was added, this time out the front of the shelter. Given that the temperatures outside were still freezing, and, conscious to avoid Kelsier befalling the same fate that Brom had, the commander instructed Brom to install 2 heaters in their residences, with vents between the rooms to allow for the transfer of heat. The rooms were small enough that this should be more than enough to keep them warm. Following long weeks at their desks, Jay and the commander finally felt confident that they understood how to properly utilise the multi-analyzer, and began researching how they could produce advanced components for themselves. Given how much trouble they'd gone to obtain the few they'd already used, being able to craft them themselves would be a massive boon, especially given their assumption that the construction of a spacecraft would require a large number of them. Although time was pressing, the whole crew took this moment of success to put down their tools and celebrate the long-awaited wedding of Commander Gardner and Brom. With little to their name, it was a small ceremony, followed by an intimate party with the crew all just enjoying each other's company. Despite their situation, it was important that they continued to celebrate the successes and joys that life had to offer them. The next day, Kelsier and Tercio decided that it was their turn and invited the whole crew to join them in celebrating their marriage. Within seconds of it starting, the commander and Tavi broke into a fistfight. Usually blood and pain would put a bit of a dampener in proceedings, but Tercio and Kelsier pressed on with their specialty. Following a few days of calm, during which everyone was simply getting on with their jobs, researching, mining, cooking, fishing, the crew was just about ready to turn in for the night when they heard the telltale screech of subsonic shock trooper drop pods. It seems this planet hadn't figured out space travel, but had managed to figure out the trick to sending people hurtling through the skies at high speed in order to take enemies by surprise. Moments later, 5 furred attackers crashed into Kelsier and Tercio's room and immediately began smashing it up and setting it alight. As Brom was unarmed at the time, the commander sent her in first to wedge the door open, after which she could make a speedy retreat while the rest of the crew fired through the door indiscriminately from their position of advantage. The attackers charged them, but the crew began a tactical retreat, peppering the attackers with bullets as they ran. The crew would eventually manage to knock down a number of the attackers, causing those remaining to panic and attempt to flee, but the crew made quick work of them. Although Kelsier and Tercio's room looked a little worse for wear, there was no lasting damage, aside from the destruction of the door, which could be easily replaced. The quick and clean outcome in favour of the crew was a testament to their teamwork and survival prowess. Having turned off the poop processor to conserve energy meant that the research benches had been fully operational for days, allowing the commander and Jay to make quick work of learning to understand the construction of advanced components. With that understanding under their belts, they finally felt ready to begin the research into how to apply those advanced components to create a starship. Building the ship would require many separate research projects, however they started with trying to understand how to create an airtight hull which could survive the vacuum of space. With their understanding advancing so quickly and so much time left until the planet killer weapon tore the ground asunder, the commander was beginning to feel hopeful. Brom, however, chided him for this, reminding him that understanding the requirements was only a small part of the battle. Actually finding the resources to construct the ship and keeping it safe until it was ready to launch was a different matter entirely. With this in mind, the commander suggested constructing a communications console and some trade beacons. It was a risky course of action. They couldn't risk hailing anyone openly, as there were likely to be Imperial ships in orbit, waiting to observe the results of the Planet Killer's test fire. But the commander's Pathfinder past meant he felt confident that he knew of ways in which to identify passing ships that might be friendly to their plight. They couldn't risk asking a ship to pick them up, as any ship attempting to land on the planet would likely be flagged by the Empire and destroyed, but they may be able to exchange goods with them from a distance, allowing them to source some additional materials for their build. As they continued their research, they felt confident enough in their understanding of spaceship hull composition to start laying out the rough outline of a first room of the ship. Even just a small first room would require a significant volume of steel, plasteel and components to put together. Although Tercio had spent weeks mining plasteel and steel and crafting components just for this occasion, these stockpiles were quickly exhausted with minimal progress on the first room of the ship. Worse still, with their understanding of ship hulls not quite complete and the freezing temperatures outside, Brom was struggling to build the hull, botching multiple sections of it and wasting more of their already limited resources. The frustration of feeling so close but so far from their goal was getting to the crew, but the commander consoled them with the fact that they were so far ahead of where they had initially anticipated that they were still in a good position to get off this rock. As if hearing the commander trying to keep morale up, a group of raiders picked that very moment to raid the base. These raiders were well equipped, toting guns instead of the crude melee weapons of their predecessors. They seemed to be taking some time to size up their options and determine the best way to attack the base, and Brom took full advantage of this, using the time to erect a wall of sandbags at the end of the entrance to the base. The sandbags would provide additional cover for the crew, reducing the chances of them being gunned down while allowing them to return fire to the exposed raiders as they clambered through the defensive system. Unfortunately for the crew, the raiders' weapons had a similar effective range to theirs, so the raiders didn't need to clamber over the defences and instead kept their distance. The two groups traded fire for a while, leading to a bloody and drawn-out affair. Eager to draw the attackers through the defences to inflict extra damage on them and give themselves time to tend to their wounded, the crew beat a riskier retreat, breaking from the safety of their cover to escape around the wall of the entrance. None of them had escaped the first encounter unscathed. The commander and Tavi were the worst off, so Kelsier and Tercio prioritised treating their wounds. The longer they stayed standing, the longer they could fight. As they tended to their wounded, a number of the attackers succumbed to blood loss following the initial firefight. With only a couple left standing and the worst of their wounds treated, the crew rushed the attackers and felled them quickly. The final attacker had gone around the south of the base, presumably to attack the crew's exposed mining equipment. However, the crew had no intention of letting him. Angry from the damage that had been inflicted by his comrades, they surged out of the gates at the rear of the base and made quick work of the final attacker. They shot him dead while he was knee-deep in the corpses of their dumping ground. That would save them a trip later. The crew treated their wounds and returned to bed for a short nap before starting the day. There was no time to spare for letting their wounds heal fully, they had work to get on with. As Brom continued working on the hull of the ship, the commander and Jay felt as though they finally had a good understanding of the construction of ship hulls and began to choose which aspect of the ship would form the basis of their next project. After a brief discussion, they decided that life support systems would be up next. They would need oxygen and water if they had any hope of surviving in the ship. With the ship finally becoming a tangible object, if not a very sturdy or fit-for-purpose object, the commander decided it was time to actually start extracting the deep chem from the nearby deposit. The lack of components that had stopped them initially wouldn't be an issue anymore now that they could craft some themselves. Or so he thought. The commander and Jay had made incredibly light work of their research into life support systems and, with the deep chem pump now available, moved straight onto researching rocket propulsion. Once they had the chem fuel, they would need the engines to feed it into. The commander's suggestion that they could now create their chem fuel network as components wouldn't be scarce was only partially correct. What he'd unfortunately failed to account for was the fact that both the network and the components required steel, which they were suddenly sorely lacking in. Tercio had been mining away consistently at the steel deposit underneath the solar panels, but despite his skill, mining with a deep drill was just an inherently slow task, and he wasn't able to keep up with the demands of both the starship and the chem fuel network. Having discussed the build of the ship with the commander at length over their time on the planet, Brom knew that the commander had been anticipating building a nuclear reactor on board the ship to provide power for the life support systems and all other auxiliary systems they would need. However, as Brom was outside working on a section of the hull near the solar panel, she had an idea. What if they used solar power for the ship? She ran inside to speak to the commander about this, and after a brief discussion with Jay, they both agreed it was a good idea. They already knew how to build solar panels, so no new research would be needed, which would help them speed up the building process. And, as the hull wasn't finished yet, they wouldn't need to tear down many completed parts of the ship to include the solar panels. The commander and Brom began planning out where on the ship these would go, and Jay interjected that while the ship was still on the ground, they could use the solar panels they attached to it to feed into the shelter's power grid, making the most of the materials they would be using. This would involve extending the perimeter wall to allow the solar panels to unfurl completely, but that was a small ask in the grand scheme of things. The days were progressing slowly. Terrasail finished clearing off all of the surface steel from the peninsula. It was faster to extract than mining from below the surface, however, it was soon gone and only the subsurface steel remained. What little he had gathered from above ground had allowed him to finish the chemfuel network, however, the ship hull was still in a state of chaos. Relieved to finally be able to celebrate a small win, Brom turned on the deep chem pump and started pumping deep chem straight out into the environment. It seems as though she'd messed up a connecting pipe somewhere. She quickly shut it off to minimise the environmental impact, of course. On the planet that was going to be blown to pieces in 6 to 8 days, at least she has a code and she lives by it. Although the plan to add the ship's solar panels to the shelter's power grid had been a solid one, they currently did not have the materials required to build the ship's solar panels, and, with power grid struggling once more, they had to build a 6th, static solar panel. Conscious that they had accumulated a sizable number of animal pelts over the last few weeks, and would soon need an abundance of advanced components for the ship, the commander sent Kelsier on a little trip to Studybot to trade. Why he sent the only member of the crew who was heavily pregnant off on a trek into the wilds, who can really say? With the leak in the system fixed, the refinery finally saw action and chemfuel began to be produced. Brom had made a storage tank for it inside the ship, so as to provide a repository that could be used to automatically refuel the engines once they were in space. The researchers were speeding through the ship-based research projects at a rate of knots. I guess working on a number of projects all around the same general area of understanding was helping them understand the new topics quickly. They moved on to navigation next. The ship wouldn't get anywhere without a pilot and a control console. There was plenty of construction work to be done, specifically on the starship. However, without the required materials, no progress could be made. Given the ridiculous amount of materials they would need, and the ridiculous lack of time they had to get them, Tersail requested that Brom hop onto the second deep drill to help him extract some metal. Kelsier arrived at Studybot and purchased all 3 of their advanced components, along with some fancy meals for herself with the excess silver. Given she was heavily pregnant and had been sent on a trek across the landscape, she didn't think the commander could argue with her treating herself. As night fell on the 1st of April, a clutch of angry beavers threw themselves at the crew. Thankfully, the crew were able to deftly handle the beavers and absolutely smash them. As it was April, and thus spring once again, it was growing season. Tersail asked Brom to help him sow the fields while Kelsier was still away. He thought it would be a nice treat for her to return to see the fields already planted, especially given the late stage of her pregnancy. Working the fields would have been a slow and tedious task for her. As it turns out, Tersail definitely had the right idea, as immediately upon her return the next morning, Kelsier went into labour. Not sure whether he should attend the birth in the role of father-to-be or in the role of the doctor, Tersail instead did neither and left the base to go and plant some rice while his baby was born back home. Thankfully, despite Tersail's best attempts at extreme negligence, Kelsier gave birth to a happy, healthy baby, the first new rebel of the next generation. Hey folks, Tuna here, just dropping by once again to say thank you for watching. I'm very much enjoying making these videos, and it seems like you guys are really enjoying them too, so I'm very glad about that. I think we've probably got another episode or 2, probably 2 or 3 actually, in this series, still to go. Depends, we'll see how the rest of the gameplay turns out. But yeah, after that, I'm debating whether to start a sort of a long series with, you know, lots more colonists coming and going, or whether to do another sort of limited length series. And I was just kind of curious for your guys' thoughts on that one. I think if we do a long series, I might try and come up with some sort of system whereby you guys can, you know, put names in for colonists, and we can try and name some colonists after your choices. But it might be the case that it's better to do a shorter one, just to sort of continue to develop my skills before we go into a longer one. But yeah, if you guys can let me know if you have any thoughts on that one down in the comments below. Other than that, I will see you next Saturday for the next episode of our Stranded Rebels series. Bye!